Hey dreamers, welcome to Sleeping Legends. This is the little corner of YouTube where stories aren't just told, they're lived, felt, and carried into the quiet of the night. Whether you're here to relax, drift off, or just escape for a while, you're in the right place. Every story we share has a little magic stitched between the words. Some are whispered from ancient myths, some are born from forgotten places, and others are fresh tales waiting to become legends of their own. So find your comfiest spot, wrap yourself in a blanket, and let your mind wander as we step into a world where dreams blur with reality. Because here, in the land of sleeping legends, bedtime isn't the end of the day. It's the beginning of an adventure. Have you ever wondered how something as mysterious as human consciousness came to exist? Today, we're diving into one of the greatest puzzles in history, the story of how awareness evolved into the unique, self-aware, meaning-seeking consciousness that defines us as humans. But before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments below. I'm curious to see just how far and wide this community reaches. And hey, if you enjoy exploring deep questions like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another journey into the unknown. Imagine for a moment standing in a vast African landscape 300,000 years ago. The air is thick with dust and the distant calls of animals that no longer exist. You see a figure approaching through the tall grass, upright, purposeful, unmistakably human in form. This being has the same skull capacity as you, the same dexterous hands, the same vocal apparatus capable of complex speech. Their eyes hold intelligence, perhaps even recognition of your gaze, meeting theirs. But here's what would unnerve you most, the silence behind those eyes. Not stupidity, far from it. These early humans were crafting sophisticated tools, controlling fire with precision that would impress modern survivalists, hunting in coordinated groups across landscapes that would challenge today's most experienced trackers. They were solving problems, adapting to environments, even caring for their injured and elderly. Yet something was missing, something so fundamental to our experience that its absence creates an almost uncanny valley effect when we try to imagine these early minds. They had not yet crossed the threshold into symbolic consciousness, the peculiar mental faculty that allows us to see a red sunset and think of blood, to hear thunder and imagine gods, to look at death and invent eternity. This is the story of the longest pause in human development, a 250,000 years when our species possessed all the biological equipment for modern consciousness, but hadn't yet turned it on. The archaeological record from this period reads like a technical manual written by brilliant engineers who had never encountered poetry. Tools of stunning sophistication, evidence of complex planning and social cooperation, but an almost complete absence of what we would recognize as symbolic culture. Consider the Schöningen spears from Germany, dating to 400,000 years ago. Wooden hunting spears, so perfectly engineered that they rival modern javelin design. The makers understood aerodynamics, wood grain, balance, and trajectory. These weren't crude pointed sticks, but precision instruments that required years of accumulated knowledge to perfect. Yet the same hands that crafted these marvels left no cave paintings, no carved figurines, no beads, no evidence of the symbolic thinking that we consider essentially human. Or take the evidence from Kesem Cave in Israel, where 400,000 years ago early humans were not just using fire, but engineering it, creating controlled combustion systems for cooking, heating, and tool-making. They understood thermal dynamics, fuel management, and ventilation. They could transform raw materials through controlled chemistry, yet they left no symbolic marks on their cave walls. No evidence that fire meant anything to them beyond its practical applications. The silence is most haunting when we consider their social complexity. Sites like Bildungsleben in Germany show evidence of organized living spaces from 400,000 years ago. Areas designated for different activities, shared cooking spaces, tool workshops. These were communities with rules, divisions of labor, possibly even primitive forms of leadership. They cared for disabled members, as evidenced by healed injuries that would have required long-term care. They had culture in the anthropological sense, learned behaviors passed down through generations. But where were the stories? Where were the rituals that would have given meaning to this care? Where were the symbols that would have marked identity, status, or belonging? The archaeological silence suggests these early humans lived in a world of pure pragmatism, where a spear was just a spear, fire was just a tool, and death was just the end of function. This presents us with a profound puzzle. If consciousness is simply a matter of brain size and complexity, why didn't it emerge earlier? The cranial capacity of early Homo sapiens was virtually identical to ours. Their brains had the same basic architecture. The same regions we now know are associated with language, abstract thinking, and symbolic reasoning. The hardware was there, but the software remained stubbornly dormant. The puzzle deepens when we examine their technology. These weren't crude hunter-gatherers stumbling through existence. By 300,000 years ago, they had developed hafting techniques that required sophisticated understanding of adhesives, leverage, and material science. They were heat-treating stone to alter its molecular structure, essentially practicing metallurgy before metal existed. They understood the properties of different materials so well they could predict how they would behave under various conditions. Yet this same technological sophistication existed in a symbolic vacuum. The tools show no decoration, no marks of ownership or identity. The living spaces show no evidence of ritual or ceremony. The dead were disposed of efficiently, but without the grave goods, ochre, or positioning that would later become universal markers of symbolic burial. It's as if these early humans were living in a world of pure function, where every object existed only for its immediate practical purpose. A world without metaphor, without the mental capacity to see one thing in terms of another. They could understand that fire makes stone easier to work, but not that fire might represent the power of the sun, or the anger of spirits, or the gift of gods. This functional but non-symbolic existence persisted for an almost incomprehensibly long time. While individual populations might have developed localized symbolic behaviors, a few scratches on ochre here, some deliberately arranged objects there, these sparks never caught fire in the broader population. They flickered and died, leaving barely detectable traces in the archaeological record. The implications are staggering. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived lives of extraordinary competence but apparent philosophical emptiness. They solved complex problems, but never asked why the problems existed. They adapted to changing environments, but never wondered about the forces causing the changes. They lived and died, but left no evidence that they pondered the meaning of either. This is not to suggest they were automata or that their lives lacked richness. Modern studies of non-symbolic cultures suggest these early humans likely had complex emotional lives, rich social relationships, perhaps even primitive forms of aesthetic appreciation. They may have told stories around fires, stories that lived only in memory and died with their tellers. They may have had traditions, songs, dances, entire cultures of the ephemeral that left no archaeological trace. But what they lacked was the ability to crystallize these experiences into external symbols, to encode meaning into objects that could outlast individual lifespans. They hadn't yet discovered how to make the invisible visible, how to trap abstract thought in concrete form. They were living fully in the present moment, capable but contained within the boundaries of immediate experience. The question that haunts this entire period is not whether these early humans were intelligent. Clearly they were. The question is whether intelligence alone is sufficient for consciousness as we understand it. Whether the spark that ignites symbolic thinking requires something beyond mere cognitive capacity. Whether consciousness, in its fullest form, is not just about having a complex brain, but about using that brain in a fundamentally different way. As we stand at the threshold of understanding our own consciousness, looking back at these 250,000 years of brilliant but silent ancestors, we're forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility. That consciousness as we experience it is not inevitable, not the natural outcome of big brains and complex societies. That it required something else, some confluence of factors that took hundreds of thousands of years to align. The silence of these early humans echoes across deep time, a reminder that the chattering, symbol-making, meaning-obsessed consciousness we take for granted is not the default state of intelligent beings. It is something stranger, more fragile and more remarkable than we typically imagine. A flame that somehow learned to kindle itself, but only after an almost endless darkness. Chapter 2. The flickering flame. Around 150,000 years ago, something began to stir. Not the sudden explosion of consciousness that would come much later, but tentative sparks. The first hints that the human mind was beginning to reach towards something beyond pure functionality. These early glimmers of symbolic behavior appeared sporadically across Africa, flickering to life in isolated populations before dying out again, leaving archaeologists centuries later to puzzle over their meaning. The story begins in caves along the southern coast of Africa, where early humans had begun to exploit marine resources with increasing sophistication. At sites like Pinnacle Point and Clay's River mouth, we find evidence of systematic shellfish harvesting, suggesting these populations had developed complex understanding of tidal cycles, seasonal patterns, and resource management. But more intriguingly, we begin to find something else. Ochre, red ochre, iron oxide that stains everything it touches the color of blood or sunset, appears in these sites not just as raw material but as something that has been deliberately processed. Pieces show grinding marks, evidence of being mixed with other substances, signs of being prepared for some purpose beyond mere collection. This is our first glimpse of humans treating a material not just for its practical properties, but possibly for its symbolic potential. But the ochre presents us with a maddening puzzle. While we can see that it was being processed, we cannot determine how it was being used. If these early humans were painting their bodies, the paint has long since washed away. If they were marking objects, the objects have decayed. If they were creating art on cave walls, those walls have not survived or have not yet been discovered. We are left with the tools of symbolic expression, but not the expressions themselves, like finding a paintbrush, but not the painting. The first unambiguous evidence of symbolic thinking comes from Blombos Cave in South Africa, around 100,000 years ago. Here, archaeologists discovered pieces of ochre not just ground into powder, but deliberately engraved with cross-hatched patterns. These are not random scratches or accidental marks. They show clear intentionality, repetitive patterns that suggest symbolic meaning. Someone sat in that cave and carefully carved abstract designs into ochre, creating perhaps the world's first examples of abstract art. Alongside the engraved ochre, Blombos Cave yielded another treasure, tiny shell beads, each carefully pierced with holes for stringing. These nacarious shells had been collected from the coast, brought inland, and transformed into ornaments. The holes were made with precision, suggesting they were strung together into necklaces, bracelets, or sewn onto clothing. This represents a cognitive revolution, the understanding that objects can carry meaning beyond their natural function, that they can serve as symbols of identity, status, or belonging. But here's what makes the Blombos find so tantalizing and frustrating. They represent isolated sparks, not widespread fires. The engraved ochre and shell beads appear in specific layers of the cave and then vanish from subsequent layers. The symbolic behavior that created them seems to have flickered to life, persisted for perhaps a few generations, and then died out. Other sites from the same time period show no similar symbolic behaviors. Whatever sparked this early creativity was local, temporary, and fragile. This pattern of symbolic behavior appearing and then disappearing repeats throughout the archaeological record of this period. At Border Cave, high in the mountains between South Africa and Eswatini, we find evidence of sophisticated plant use around 200,000 years ago. Early humans were selecting specific aromatic plants for bedding, choosing species with insect-repelling properties. This shows not just practical intelligence, but possibly aesthetic sensibility, the understanding that sleep can be not just functional, but comfortable, perhaps even pleasant. Yet even this sophisticated behavior appears intermittently. Some layers show clear evidence of plant bedding preparation, while others show only basic shelter construction. The knowledge existed, but wasn't consistently applied or maintained across generations. It's as if the spark of enhanced cognition was real, but unstable, appearing randomly and disappearing just as unpredictably. The instability of early symbolic behavior raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. If the cognitive capacity for symbolic thinking existed 100,000 years ago, why didn't it immediately and permanently transform human behavior? Why did these early expressions of creativity and meaning-making prove so ephemeral? Part of the answer may lie in demography. Genetic studies suggest that human populations during this period were extremely small and fragmented. The total global population of Homo sapiens may have numbered in the tens of thousands at most, scattered across the vast African continent in small, isolated bands. In such small populations, cultural innovations are extraordinarily fragile. A few bad seasons, a local catastrophe, or even just the death of key knowledge keepers could erase entire traditions. Climate also played a crucial role. The period between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago was marked by extreme climate variability. Ice ages and interglacials created cycles of expansion and contraction in habitable environments. Populations that had developed stable traditions during favorable periods were repeatedly disrupted by climate shifts that forced migrations, cultural fragmentation, and population crashes. The famous Toba supervolcanic eruption around 74,000 years ago exemplifies this pattern. The eruption created a global volcanic winter, dramatically cooling temperatures worldwide and likely causing severe ecological disruption. Genetic evidence suggests the human population crashed to perhaps fewer than 10,000 individuals globally, a bottleneck so severe that it left permanent marks in our genome. Any symbolic traditions that had been developing would have been catastrophically disrupted. Yet even accounting for demographic and environmental factors, the pattern of flickering symbolic behavior suggests something deeper about the nature of consciousness. The archaeological record shows that the cognitive capacity for symbolic thinking was present but not self-sustaining. Unlike tool-making, which once learned tends to persist and improve across generations, symbolic behavior required some additional factor to stabilize and spread. This additional factor may have been social rather than cognitive. Symbolic systems, whether artistic traditions, ritual practices, or even complex language, require networks to survive. A single individual can invent a symbol, but for that symbol to have meaning, it must be shared, understood, and transmitted to others. In small, isolated populations, the social networks necessary to sustain symbolic systems simply didn't exist. Hey dreamers, if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to tap that like button. It really helps more people find these legends. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think will happen next? And of course, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale we share here on Sleeping Legends. But here's what makes the Blombos finds so tantalizing and frustrating. They represent isolated sparks, not widespread fires. The engraved ochre and shell beads appear in specific layers of the cave and then vanish from subsequent layers. The symbolic behavior that created them seems to have flickered to life, persisted for perhaps a few generations, and then died out. Other sites from the same time period show no similar symbolic behaviors. Whatever sparked this early creativity was local, temporary, and fragile. This pattern of symbolic behavior appearing and then disappearing repeats throughout the archaeological record of this period. At Border Cave, high in the mountains between South Africa and Eswatini, we find evidence of sophisticated plant use around 200,000 years ago. Early humans were selecting specific aromatic plants for bedding, choosing species with insect-repelling properties. This shows not just practical intelligence, but possibly aesthetic sensibility. The understanding that sleep can be not just functional, but comfortable, perhaps even pleasant. Yet even this sophisticated behavior appears intermittently. Some layers show clear evidence of plant bedding preparation, while others show only basic shelter construction. The knowledge existed, but wasn't consistently applied or maintained across generations. It's as if the spark of enhanced cognition was real, but unstable, appearing randomly and disappearing just as unpredictably. The instability of early symbolic behavior raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. If the cognitive capacity for symbolic thinking existed 100,000 years ago, why didn't it immediately and permanently transform human behavior? Why did these early expressions of creativity and meaning-making prove so ephemeral? Part of the answer may lie in demography. Genetic studies suggest that human populations during this period were extremely small and fragmented. The total global population of Homo sapiens may have numbered in the tens of thousands at most, scattered across the vast African continent in small, isolated bands. In such small populations, cultural innovations are extraordinarily fragile. A few bad seasons, a local catastrophe, or even just the death of key knowledge keepers could erase entire traditions. Climate also played a crucial role. The period between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago was marked by extreme climate variability. Ice ages and interglacials created cycles of expansion and contraction in habitable environments. Populations that had developed stable traditions during favorable periods were repeatedly disrupted by climate shifts that forced migrations, cultural fragmentation, and population crashes. The famous Toba supervolcanic eruption around 74,000 years ago exemplifies this pattern. The eruption created a global volcanic winter, dramatically cooling temperatures worldwide and likely causing severe ecological disruption. Genetic evidence suggests the human population crashed to perhaps fewer than 10,000 individuals globally, a bottleneck so severe that it left permanent marks in our genome. Any symbolic traditions that had been developing would have been catastrophically disrupted. Yet even accounting for demographic and environmental factors, the pattern of flickering symbolic behavior suggests something deeper about the nature of consciousness. The archaeological record shows that the cognitive capacity for symbolic thinking was present but not self-sustaining. Unlike tool-making, which once learned tends to persist and improve across generations, symbolic behavior required some additional factor to stabilize and spread. This additional factor may have been social rather than cognitive. Symbolic systems, whether artistic traditions, ritual practices, or even complex language, require networks to survive. A single individual can invent a symbol, but for that symbol to have meaning, it must be shared, understood, and transmitted to others. In small, isolated populations, the social networks necessary to sustain symbolic systems simply didn't exist. Consider what happens when a symbolic tradition is carried by only a few individuals. If those individuals die without successfully transmitting their knowledge, the tradition dies with them. If they transmit it incompletely, the meaning degrades across generations. Only when populations become large enough and connected enough to maintain redundant transmission pathways do symbolic systems become stable and self-reinforcing. This may explain why we see consistent evidence of sophisticated toolmaking throughout this period, but only sporadic evidence of symbolic behavior. A spear-making technique can be transmitted from parent to child with minimal social overhead, show them the motions, guide their hands, correct their mistakes. But a symbolic system requires more complex social processes: storytelling, ritual participation, group identity formation. These processes are more demanding socially and thus more vulnerable to disruption. The archaeological record from this period reveals a species balanced on a knife's edge between two kinds of consciousness. The old consciousness, practical, immediate, focused on survival and environmental mastery, was fully developed and reliable. The new consciousness, symbolic, abstract, meaning-seeking, was struggling to be born, appearing in flashes but unable to sustain itself across the vicissitudes of deep time. We can imagine the frustration of archaeologists studying this period, finding tools of stunning sophistication alongside tantalizing hints of symbolic thinking, but never quite enough to reconstruct a complete picture of these early minds. It's like reading a book with most of the pages torn out, getting glimpses of a story, but never the full narrative. Yet these flickering flames are crucial to understanding our own consciousness. They show us that symbolic thinking is not a binary switch that either exists or doesn't, but rather a fragile emergence that requires specific conditions to stabilize and flourish. The long period of intermittent symbolic behavior reveals consciousness not as an inevitable outcome of intelligence, but as a precarious achievement that could have easily failed to emerge at all. As we trace these early sparks across the archaeological landscape of Africa, we're witnessing the birth pangs of something entirely new in the universe. Minds capable of creating meaning from meaninglessness, of seeing symbols in scratches, of finding significance in colored stones. The fact that this capability flickered and nearly died out multiple times makes its eventual triumph all the more remarkable. The stage was being set for something unprecedented, but the performance had not yet begun. The neural hardware was in place, the cognitive software was being debugged through trial and error, but the cultural operating system that would eventually support full symbolic consciousness was still under development. The flickering flame was real, but it had not yet learned how to sustain itself. Around 50,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. After hundreds of thousands of years of flickering sparks and dying flames, symbolic consciousness finally caught fire. Not in one place, not gradually, but explosively across the inhabited world. Cave paintings appeared in France and Spain. Shell ornaments spread across Africa and the Middle East. Musical instruments emerged in Germany. Burial goods became elaborate in Russia. The archaeological record, which had been stubbornly sparse for symbolic behavior, suddenly erupted with evidence of minds fully awakened to meaning, metaphor, and myth. This transformation was so rapid and so global that archaeologists initially questioned whether it was real. How could symbolic behavior, which had appeared only sporadically for 200,000 years, suddenly become universal and persistent? What changed in human consciousness around 50,000 years ago that made this explosion possible? The answer lies not in a single breakthrough, but in the convergence of multiple factors that had been building for millennia. Like a perfect storm, conditions aligned that finally pushed human consciousness over a critical threshold. The spark that had flickered for so long finally found the right fuel, the right environment, and the right social kindling to become a self-sustaining fire. The first factor was demographic. Around 60,000 years ago, human populations began expanding rapidly. Genetic evidence suggests that small, isolated bands began connecting into larger networks. Trade routes emerged, carrying not just goods, but ideas across vast distances. Marriage patterns shifted toward exogamy, marrying outside one's immediate group, creating social bonds that linked previously separate populations. This demographic expansion was crucial because symbolic systems require critical mass to survive and evolve. In small groups, symbolic traditions are vulnerable to random loss. A few deaths or migrations can erase entire cultural practices. But in larger, interconnected networks, symbolic systems become self-reinforcing. Multiple groups can maintain variants of the same symbolic tradition, creating redundancy that protects against loss. Ideas can spread, mutate, and recombine across populations, accelerating cultural evolution. The second factor was technological. By 50,000 years ago, humans had mastered a range of sophisticated manufacturing techniques that made symbolic expression practically feasible. They could work ivory into complex shapes, pierce shells with precision holes, mix pigments with binding agents, and create tools specifically designed for artistic purposes. The physical infrastructure for symbolic expression was finally in place. But technology alone cannot explain the explosion of symbolic behavior. Humans had possessed sophisticated tool-making abilities for hundreds of thousands of years without using them for symbolic purposes. What changed was not just the ability to create symbols, but the motivation and social framework for doing so. This brings us to the third factor, cognitive architecture. While human brain size had remained relatively constant for hundreds of thousands of years, the internal organization of the brain may have continued evolving. Specifically, the connections between different brain regions, the neural networks that support language, memory, and abstract reasoning, may have reached a critical level of integration around 50,000 years ago. Neuroscientists call this the global workspace theory of consciousness. The idea is that consciousness emerges not from any single brain region, but from the ability of different regions to share information flexibly and rapidly. When sensory input, memory, language, and reasoning systems can all access and modify each other's processing, the result is the kind of fluid, creative consciousness that characterizes modern humans. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Around 50,000 years ago, we see not just the emergence of symbolic behavior, but its explosion into multiple domains simultaneously. Art appears alongside music, which appears alongside complex burial practices, which appear alongside long-distance trade. This suggests a general enhancement in cognitive flexibility rather than the development of specific symbolic capacities. The fourth factor was environmental. After millions of years of extreme climate variability, the period around 50,000 years ago saw the emergence of relatively stable environmental conditions in key regions. This stability allowed populations to grow and establish the kind of permanent settlements that could support complex cultural traditions. Stable environments also facilitated the specialization that symbolic culture requires. In a world of constant crisis, everyone must focus on immediate survival. But when basic needs are reliably met, some individuals can devote time and energy to non-practical pursuits, creating art, developing rituals, exploring abstract ideas. The emergence of symbolic culture may reflect the first time in human history when enough people had enough leisure time to sustain purely cultural activities. The fifth factor was linguistic. While the capacity for language may have existed much earlier, the development of fully modern language with complex grammar, recursive structure, and the ability to discuss abstract concepts may not have been complete until around 50,000 years ago. Language is not just a communication tool, but a thinking tool. It allows us to hold complex ideas in working memory, to reason about abstract concepts, and to share subtle distinctions of meaning. More importantly, language allows for the transmission of symbolic systems across generations with high fidelity. The artistic tradition that depends on direct observation and imitation is vulnerable to degradation over time. But a tradition that can be described, explained, and situated within a broader narrative framework becomes much more stable and transmissible. Language turned cultural traditions from fragile chains of imitation into robust networks of meaning. The convergence of these factors, demographics, technology, cognition, environment, and language, created what systems theorists call an emergent transition. Like water suddenly becoming steam when heated to exactly 100 degrees Celsius, human consciousness crossed a phase transition around 50,000 years ago. The same basic components that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly began interacting in fundamentally new ways. This explains both the rapidity and the universality of the symbolic explosion. Once the threshold was crossed in one population, the advantages of symbolic culture, enhanced cooperation, improved technological transmission, more effective environmental adaptation, allowed it to spread rapidly to other populations through migration, trade, and cultural exchange. The archaeological evidence for this explosion is overwhelming and global. In Europe, the famous cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira represent just the tip of an iceberg of symbolic expression that included carved figurines, musical instruments, elaborate burial goods, and complex tool decorations. In Africa, trade networks emerged that carried shells, ochre, and exotic stones hundreds of kilometers from their sources. In Australia, rock art traditions began that would continue unbroken for tens of thousands of years. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this explosion was its psychological dimension. The humans who lived through this transition were experiencing consciousness in a fundamentally new way. For the first time, minds were able to create meaning that transcended immediate experience. They could see symbols in scratches, stories in paintings, spirits in natural phenomena. They could imagine past and future, construct elaborate mythologies, and create social bonds based on shared abstract beliefs rather than just kinship or immediate reciprocity. This transformation was not just cultural but existential. These humans were the first beings in the universe, as far as we know, capable of asking not just what or how, but why. They were the first to experience the peculiar burden and gift of consciousness that wonders about its own existence, that can conceive of death while being alive, that can imagine infinities while living finite lives. The explosion of symbolic culture 50,000 years ago represents the moment when human consciousness became recognizably modern. The basic architecture of meaning-making that emerged then, art, music, ritual, storytelling, religious experience, remains the foundation of human culture today. Our contemporary obsession with symbols, stories, and significance can be traced directly back to this pivotal moment in our species' history. Yet this transformation also introduced new vulnerabilities. Symbolic consciousness created not just meaning, but the possibility of meaninglessness. Not just hope, but despair. Not just connection, but alienation. The same cognitive flexibility that allowed humans to create art and music also made possible anxiety about the future, regret about the past, and existential questioning that could spiral into psychological crisis. The price of consciousness, it seems, is the loss of the animal contentment that characterized our pre-symbolic ancestors. Once minds become capable of symbolic thought, they can never again be fully satisfied with mere survival. They require meaning, purpose, narrative coherence, requirements that the universe does not automatically provide. As we trace the explosion of symbolic consciousness 50,000 years ago, we're witnessing not just an evolutionary transition, but the birth of the human condition as we know it. The cave paintings, shell beads, and bone flutes of our ancestors represent the first stirrings of the same consciousness that created symphonies, wrote poetry, built cathedrals, and eventually developed the scientific understanding that allows us to trace its own origins. The fire that ignited 50,000 years ago has never stopped burning. It has grown from flickering flames on cave walls to the global networks of meaning that now encompass our planet. Every word we speak, every story we tell, every symbol we recognize participates in the same symbolic consciousness that first emerged in the minds of our African ancestors as they mixed ochre with fat and pressed their hands against limestone walls, leaving the first permanent traces of minds that had learned to see meaning in everything. The ignition was complete, consciousness had awakened, and the universe would never be the same. And that's the end of tonight's tale here on Sleeping Legends. I'd love to know what part of the story stayed with you the most. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed drifting into this legend with me, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our growing family of dreamers. And of course, give this video a like so more storytellers at heart can find their way here. Until next time, may your night be peaceful, your dreams be vivid, and your heart always ready for another legend.